For 30 years, Nathaniel Reyes believed his mother had never been anything but exactly what he saw. A woman who cleaned houses for a living, who never talked about her own childhood, who changed the subject so smoothly whenever anyone asked about her life before he was born that he'd stopped noticing she was doing it at all. It took a stranger's letter, delivered to his office 2 months after her funeral, to tell him that the woman who raised him alone in a 2-bedroom apartment had once filled concert halls under a different name and had walked away from every bit of it the year he was born, not because she lost her talent, but because she refused to lose him. Stay with me. This is a story about the identities people are willing to bury and what it means to finally understand the size of what someone gave up so quietly you never even noticed the absence. Nathaniel Reyes was 34 years old, 2 months into grieving his mother's sudden death from a heart condition none of them had known she had, still moving through his days with the particular numbness that follows a loss nobody saw coming, when an envelope arrived at his office addressed in unfamiliar, elegant handwriting, the kind of cursive that belonged to a generation that had learned penmanship as a formal discipline rather than an afterthought. Inside was a letter from a woman named Beatrice Lindqvist, a retired concert promoter in her 80s writing from Vienna, expressing condolences for the passing of Elena Castellano, a name Nathaniel had never once heard attached to his mother in 34 years of knowing her as Elena Reyes. He assumed, at first, it was a case of mistaken identity, some clerical confusion in an old promoter's failing memory, a letter meant for some other grieving family entirely. He nearly threw the letter away, setting it aside on the corner of his desk with a stack of other condolence correspondence he hadn't yet found the strength to answer properly. But something about the specificity of it, a reference to a performance at the Musikverein in 1994, a description of the particular clarity she brought to Chopin that no one since has quite managed to replicate, a detail about the exact shade of blue dress she'd worn to a gala the same year, made him set it aside instead, unable to shake the strange, unsettled feeling that the letter was not, in fact, a mistake at all, that whoever this Beatrice Lindqvist was, she had known his mother in a way he never had. Elena Reyes had raised Nathaniel alone in a 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store, working as a house cleaner for most of his childhood and later as a part-time piano teacher for neighborhood children once his father, a man Nathaniel barely remembered beyond a few hazy impressions of cologne and a low, unfamiliar laugh, had left when Nathaniel was 3 years old. She was warm, quietly funny, endlessly patient with him in the specific way only single parents raising a child completely alone manage to be. Staying up late to help with homework, she barely had the energy to understand herself after a full day of cleaning other people's houses, and she played piano beautifully, though she'd always brushed off compliments about it with a small, deflecting laugh, telling him she'd simply picked it up somewhere along the way, the same way she picked up sewing and gardening and the dozen other quiet competencies she never made a fuss about, presenting each one as an ordinary skill rather than the product of decades of formal training. She never talked about her own parents. She never mentioned growing up anywhere specific, deflecting questions about her childhood with the same practiced smoothness she deflected compliments about her playing, redirecting conversations toward Nathaniel's day, Nathaniel's schoolwork, Nathaniel's life, until he simply grew up assuming, the way children often assume things about parents who never explain themselves, that there was nothing much to tell, that his mother's history began, more or less, the day he was born, and that whatever came before it wasn't worth asking about. Nathaniel spent the following weeks doing something he'd never had reason to do while his mother was alive, researching her, staying up past midnight scrolling through digitized newspaper archives and old concert databases with a growing, disorienting sense that he was investigating a stranger who happened to share his mother's face. He wrote back to Beatrice Lindqvist, who responded within days with photographs, grainy newspaper clippings, a concert program from Vienna dated 1994, a black-and-white photograph of a young woman at a piano who was unmistakably, despite the decades and the different name, his mother, her posture at the keys exactly the same as it had been in their small living room every evening of his childhood. Elena Castellano, Beatrice's letters explained, had been one of the most promising concert pianists of her generation throughout her 20s, trained at a conservatory in Europe from the age of 6, praised by critics across 3 continents for a technical precision matched by an unusual emotional depth rarely found together in performers so young. On the verge of a major recording contract that would have cemented her among the defining performers of her instrument for that era. And then, in 1995, she had simply disappeared from the concert circuit entirely, canceling a season of engagements with no public explanation, and had never performed publicly again, her name slowly fading from programs and retrospectives until only a small, dedicated circle of enthusiasts still remembered it at all. I always wondered what happened to her. Beatrice wrote, her handwriting slightly unsteady but her sentences precise. We assumed illness, or perhaps a breakdown of some kind. The pressure of that world eats people alive more often than anyone admits, and Elena carried more of it than most, given her family's expectations. I am glad to finally know, though sorry it comes so late, and sorry for your loss. Nathaniel found the rest of the story in a box of his mother's papers, tucked in the back of a closet behind winter coats she rarely wore, documents he'd initially assumed were nothing more than old tax records and instead turned out to be correspondence with a European conservatory, custody paperwork, and a series of increasingly desperate letters from her own family, the Castellanos, a prominent musical family who had built their name across 2 generations of touring virtuosos and considered Elena's career the continuation of a legacy they had no intention of letting a pregnancy derail. Elena had gotten pregnant with Nathaniel during a whirlwind relationship with a touring cellist, Nathaniel's father, a relationship her family considered beneath the Castellano name and entirely incompatible with the demanding, image-conscious career they had built for her since childhood, managing every aspect of her public life down to the interviews she gave and the dresses she wore to galas. When she refused to terminate the pregnancy and insisted on keeping the baby, her family gave her an ultimatum that the letters in the box laid out in stark, unmistakable terms. Give the child up for adoption immediately after birth, resume her career and the recording contract already in motion, and let the Castellano management team handle the matter quietly and permanently, or lose access to the family's management, financial backing, and the entire professional infrastructure that had built her career from age 6, an infrastructure so total that walking away from it meant walking away from nearly everything she'd ever known. If this story is resonating with you so far, this is a good moment to hit subscribe and drop a comment about it. I love hearing which parts land hardest, and it genuinely helps more people find these stories. Now, back to Elena's choice and what it actually cost her. Elena chose Nathaniel. She left the conservatory, left the recording contract, left the family name entirely, taking only the piano itself and enough money to survive the first difficult year, disappearing from a world that had defined every year of her life since childhood, and rebuilding herself under a name nobody in that world would think to search for. In a country far enough from Vienna that no promoter or critic would ever recognize the woman cleaning houses as the pianist who'd once filled the Musikverein. The correspondence in the box painted a fuller picture than Nathaniel expected, letter after letter from his grandfather, a man he'd never met and never even known existed by name until that afternoon, each one colder and more transactional than the last, treating his mother's pregnancy not as a family event, but as a logistical problem requiring a clean, efficient solution. One letter, dated just weeks before Nathaniel's birth, laid out the adoption arrangement in explicit detail. A private, discreet placement already identified, papers drawn up and ready for signature, a return to the concert schedule projected within 8 months of the birth, framed throughout as though it were an act of generosity rather than an ultimatum. Elena's response, a carbon copy she'd apparently kept for herself, was short, and Nathaniel read it 3 times before he could fully absorb what it said. I understand what I am giving up, she had written. I have understood it since the day I found out I was pregnant. I am choosing to give it up anyway. Please do not contact me again regarding this matter. There was no further correspondence in the box after that letter, no acknowledgement of receipt, no response at all from the family that had once organized her entire life around a career she had just, in a single paragraph, walked away from without apparent hesitation. There was one more letter in the box, unsent, dated the year Nathaniel turned 18, apparently drafted and never mailed, addressed to him directly. In it, Elena had written out an explanation she'd clearly considered giving him at least once and ultimately decided against. The paper slightly yellowed with age despite never having left the folder it was filed in. "I never told you because I didn't want you to grow up believing you had cost me something," she wrote. "You didn't cost me anything, Nathaniel. You were never the thing that took my career from me, my family was. I made a choice, and I have never once regretted it. Not on the hardest nights. Not during the years the piano sat mostly untouched in our living room, because playing it seriously again always brought back a world I deliberately left behind. If I told you the whole story, I was afraid you would spend your whole life trying to give me back a career I chose to walk away from, instead of letting me simply be your mother, which was the only role I ever actually wanted once you existed." The letter went on, in Elena's careful, deliberate handwriting, to explain that she'd kept playing privately, teaching neighborhood children not for the modest income it provided, but because it let her stay connected to the one part of her old life she'd never actually wanted to give up. The music itself, separated entirely from the family, the pressure, and the name that had once defined her. "The piano was never the thing I lost," she wrote near the end of the letter. "The piano stayed with me the whole time. It was everyone standing around it that I chose to leave behind." Nathaniel sat with that letter for a long time, understanding finally why the piano in their small apartment had always felt, in some way he'd never quite been able to name as a child, like it held more weight than an ordinary piece of furniture. Why his mother's hands moved over the keys with a precision that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than casual hobby. Why she'd insisted, gently but firmly, that he take lessons even when money was tight, never once explaining that she was passing along something she'd once considered the entire shape of her own identity, quietly hoping, perhaps, that he might come to love it the way she once had, without ever knowing the weight of what loving it had cost her. He thought about every recital he'd sat through as a child, mildly bored the way children often are, never once understanding that his mother, sitting in the audience clapping proudly, had once played concert halls that made those small community recitals look like nothing at all, and had never once made him feel that comparison, never once let her old world diminish the pride she took in his small, ordinary accomplishments. He remembered, with a fresh ache, the year he'd quit lessons at 14, frustrated and unmotivated, and how gently she'd let him quit, never once arguing, never once revealing what that quiet acceptance might have actually cost her to grant so easily. Nathaniel didn't try to resurrect his mother's career posthumously in any grand, performative way, understanding that this would have been exactly the kind of gesture she'd spent 30 years quietly avoiding. Instead, he reached out to Beatrice Lindqvist and, working with her network of contacts still active in the classical music world, arranged for a small memorial recording to be released, not a manufactured comeback, but a set of recordings Beatrice had kept from Elena's actual performances in the early 1990s, restored and released properly for the first time, alongside a short written account of who Elena Castellano had actually been, including the choice she'd made and the reasons behind it, told plainly and without embellishment, without turning her decision into a tragedy when she herself had never once framed it that way. He also did something smaller, something that felt, to him, more true to the woman who'd actually raised him than any public tribute could be. He found her piano, still sitting in the apartment she'd lived in until her death, and had it restored properly for the first time in decades, moving it into his own home, where he began, slowly and clumsily, teaching himself to play the pieces Beatrice told him had been his mother's favorites, understanding that he would never approach her level of skill, and understanding, too, that this had never been the point of picking it back up. The recordings, once released quietly through a small classical archive label Beatrice arranged, drew more attention than either of them expected, first within the dedicated circle of enthusiasts who still remembered Elena Castellano's brief, brilliant run through the concert world of the early 1990s, and then, gradually, more widely, as music writers began piecing together the fuller story behind her disappearance. Nathaniel found himself fielding interview requests he mostly declined, choosing instead to write, at Beatrice's gentle encouragement, a short personal essay about discovering his mother's past, published alongside the recordings rather than promoted as a separate media event. In it, he wrote about the piano in the small apartment above the hardware store, about the recitals she'd never let feel small, about the box of letters that had rewritten 34 years of assumptions in a single afternoon. He wrote, near the end, something he hadn't fully understood until he saw it typed out in his own words, that his mother hadn't simply given up a career for him. She had chosen, deliberately and without regret, an entirely different definition of a life well spent, one built around presence rather than performance. And that understanding this now didn't make him grieve the pianist she might have remained. It made him grieve, more specifically and more gently, the mother he'd only now fully come to understand. This story is fictional, but the quiet erasure at its center, a person setting aside an entire identity to protect someone they loved and never once asking for credit or recognition for what that erasure cost them, happens in smaller, less dramatic forms in real families constantly. Parents give up careers, dreams, entire versions of themselves for children who often never fully learn the size of what was set aside on their behalf, because the giving was never meant to be seen, only felt, in the shape of a childhood built carefully around an absence the child was never meant to notice. If there's a parent in your life who has always deflected questions about who they were before you existed, it might be worth asking, gently, what that deflection has been protecting you from feeling the weight of. Elena Castellano gave up concert halls, a recording contract, and her own family's name so that Nathaniel would never have to grow up feeling like the reason something was taken from her. He didn't learn the size of that gift until a stranger's letter arrived 2 months too late for him to ever say thank you in person. Most people never get even that. Tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered a hidden part of a parent's past that changed how you understood them? I want to hear your story. And before you go, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs the reminder to ask the people who raised them who they were before they existed. Subscribe and turn on notifications. There's another story coming soon, and you won't want to miss it. Thank you for watching. May you always take the time to ask the questions before it's too late to hear the answers.